Good evening, and thanks for joining us as we continue to celebrate Women's History Month with this evening's program, History and Highballs, Obstacles and Opportunity in 20th Century American Women's Sports. If this is your first History and Highballs with us, my name is Stacy, and I handle adult education here at the museum. So whenever you sign up for one of these History and Highballs programs, you and I get to virtually spend the evening together, learning some incredible stories about places and people and what makes our state so extraordinary. Just a quick housekeeping note for tonight. We ask that you please type any questions that you have for our guest speaker into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. Once our speaker has finished their talk, our adult programs intern will ask as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to introduce and welcome our speaker this evening, Mary Jo Festle. Mary Jo Festle received her PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. She teaches recent social U.S. history at Elon University and is the author of Playing Nice, Politics and Apologies in Women's Sports, Columbia University Press, 1996, as well as two other books. So I'm going to turn things over to you. Welcome. Thanks for being with us this evening.
Hello, everybody. It's very kind of you to come out here this evening. I am a big fan of the North Carolina Museum of History and appreciate the opportunity to be here for Women's History Month. I'm going to go ahead and share a bunch of slides that I've got and that I hope you will enjoy seeing. When historians study sports, we do so that we can learn about the experiences and the interests and the values of Americans. It's very clear that throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, Americans have really loved sports. What's interesting to me is it's not just that they've loved sports, it's also that they've said it's really good for people to participate in sports. So they talk about how participating in sports builds health and fitness and strength, coordination, skill, self-discipline, a positive work ethic, character, a sense of fair play, confidence and assertiveness, the ability to get along with others, and even it helps you work with life's challenges. So here's a rhetorical question. If sports are good for you, what's the deal? Why not for women too? Weren't women supposed to develop all those great things that we just said that sports can help you with? Why couldn't someone like Ora Washington, who's on this slide, she's on the right, why couldn't she make a living as a pro athlete in the 20s, 30s, and 40s when she was an outstanding tennis and basketball player? Recently, she was inducted into the Naismith Hall of Fame for basketball, the Black Athletes Hall of Fame, the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame, yet she had to support herself as a housekeeper for her whole life. So what held women back in women's sports? The short answer for that is restrictive ideas about gender roles. When I say gender roles, I'm talking about the expectations for how a good woman, a proper woman, an appropriate woman, a normal woman was supposed to behave, or a proper man is supposed to behave. In addition, unwillingness to share resources, attention, and expertise also held women back, but those were often related to gender roles too. So it's probably not surprising to you that throughout much of the 20th century, American ideas about gender said that sports, really competitive, serious sports, were not appropriate for adult women. But that's not the whole story. People have choices about the degree to which they comply with gender expectations. They might comply fully, they might comply partially, they might defy gender roles. And the other thing that's important to know is that ideas about gender are not fixed. They do change. They can change, they do change. And although often in the 20th century, American gender roles for women didn't include serious participation in sports, there were periods of more acceptance. So the story of women's sports is a story of ups and downs. So my thesis for today is that there were a lot of ups and downs for women's sports in the 20th century. And the second part of my thesis is that those ups and downs often reflected what was going on in American society more generally, not just in sports. So I'm going to describe some of the ups and downs and the historic context for them in my talk this evening. I want you to do a little thinking first before I get too much farther. Think about what you may already know about women's sports history. And here's the question. When do you think the first really popular American woman athlete was competing? Here are your choices to consider. Would that be in the early 2000s? Would that have been in the 1970s, the 1940s, or the 1920s? I hope you have an answer in your head. And I will tell you that the correct answer is the 1920s. There were a lot of, there are a number of really important, popular, and very well-known women athletes in the 1920s. I'm going to tell you about a few of them. The first is Babe Didrikson. She was born Mildred Didrikson, but she got the nickname Babe after Babe Ruth when she was a girl because she was such a great athlete. She became well known for her exploits in track and field. When she went to track meets as an individual, she often won more points than entire teams. She in the 20s and early 30s, women were only allowed to compete in 3 events in the Olympics. So in her 3 events, she won 2 golds and 1 silver medal. She was amazingly talented, not just in track and field, but in basketball. She could play baseball. She traveled around playing with men's exhibition teams for a while. She could box. She took up golf as an adult. The picture on the right is when she was older and helped start the LPGA. So Americans knew Babe Didrikson, but they were also fascinated by Babe Didrikson. Oh, and by the way, ESPN named Didrikson the 10th greatest athlete of the 20th century. Not the 10th best woman athlete, the 10th best athlete of the 20th century. So Americans were fascinated by her because she was just herself. She openly loved competing. She was also quite funny. Asked if there was any sport she didn't play, she said, yeah, dolls. I don't play with dolls. She was also really cocky, really brash. She would show up before a meet or a tournament and she would kind of yell, okay, the babe is here now. Who's going to finish in second place? She didn't really care about looking feminine when she was younger, so she really stretched gender roles. The picture on the right is when she was older and was more concerned about looking feminine. So what you should know about Babe is that everyone knew her name. Huge crowds roared when she competed. Hollywood celebrities wanted to know her. Cities were giving her the key to the city. She was asked to go on a national vaudeville tour. I don't know what the comparable thing would be today, maybe to have your own reality TV show. So that's Babe. Another athlete that everyone knew in the 1920s was Gertrude Ederle. As you can tell from these pictures, Ederle was a swimmer. From 1921 to 1925, she set 29 American and world records for various events in swimming. She also went to the Olympics and won a gold and a couple bronzes. But when she really became famous was in 1926 as the first woman to swim across the English Channel. Until then, only 5 people had ever swum across the English Channel, and they were all men, all 5 of them. The record, the best time was 16 and a half hours. And when Ederle did it, She beat the men's existing record by almost 2 hours. So the picture on the left is Ederle uh, covered in grease to try to deal with some of the cold in the water. And on the right, she's swimming. And this image was taken by a New York newspaper. It is the parade that greeted Ederle when she returned to New York after crossing the English Channel. I don't know if you can tell, but in the middle, she is in a car going through this parade, and there were estimated to be 2 million people at that parade to greet her. So I'm not kidding when I say that everyone knew who Gertrude Ederle was. Also quickly mention Helen Wills. She was a tennis player. She was the best woman tennis player in the world for about 9 years in the 1920s and 30s. She too was a celebrity. She hung out with royalty and artists and film stars. She practiced against men to get better at tennis. And in 1933, she beat the 8th-ranked male player in an exhibition match. Um, these are just a couple of headlines. The match of the century when she was playing a French star in 1926 described them as 2 women bigger than Babe Ruth. Couple of images from magazines at the time. On the left, Time Magazine, Saturday Evening Post, Vanity Fair. So she was on the cover of very popular magazines too. So now you know 3 nationally known and really popular women athletes. People who made it clear that women could be strong and capable. Basketball was also really popular at women's schools in the first couple decades of the 20th century. This is a photo from Bennett College in Greensboro. So for historians, it's not surprising that these athletic achievements by women were happening in the 1920s. And that's because of what else was happening in the 1920s in terms of gender. So I'll mention a few of those things. A reminder of my thesis, that women's sports often reflected larger societal trends related to gender in the US. So here's a little bit of what was going on in the 20s. The period was called the era of the new woman. Women were making great strides in education starting around 1900. By 1900, women were 20% of all college graduates. So there were women's colleges popping up all over the place, and some men's school also accepted women. There were also new professional opportunities for these women who got college degrees, as long as they were unmarried. Married women were not supposed to have professions, but they were in fields that you might not be surprised in. They were in teaching, they were in nursing, librarians, and doing this new job, which today we would call social work, but at the time was working in settlement houses, working with poor and immigrants in big cities. Also, what was going at the time was the suffrage movement, the movement by women, which had been going on for many decades, but really took off in the 19 teens, the movement to get the right to vote for women. The picture on the left is from a parade in 1913. You can see these are women in proper dress for middle-class women, covered from head to toe and wearing hats. And those were kind of the mainstream women who were working for suffrage. On the right is a picture of Lucy Burns, who was one of the more militant suffragists. She and some of the women in the National Women's Party picketed outside the White House. And this was really pretty unprecedented and appalled people that you would protest outside the White House. And they were arrested for that, thrown in prison for quite a long time. And she actually did a hunger strike while she was there. Another group stretching traditional gender roles in the 20s were called flappers. These were especially young women, and they were challenging traditional gender roles in a lot of things. In the way they dressed, for one thing, they were not wearing dresses from head to toe. They were showing a lot of skin, their arms, their necks, their legs. Um, they wore short hair and sometimes hats. And also they just behaved in different ways. The women on the right are smoking, which women hadn't done before this period. They were drinking, they were going to speakeasies, illegal places to drink during Prohibition. They were dating without chaperones, and they were flirting, and they had very loose attitudes about sex. One other thing about women in the 20s, a few of them were even entrepreneurs. This is Madam C.J. Walker. She was the first woman who was a self-made millionaire, and she made her money in cosmetics and hair products. So that's a little bit about what was going on for women in terms of gender role stretching in the 20s. But I want to make another point, another idea to remember, and that is whenever there is social change, there's usually also opposition to change. So this is my attempt to show that visually with an image. On one side, you've got someone pushing for change, but then you've got somebody on the other side pushing back and resisting that change. And that was really significant related to women's sports early in the 20th century. So sportswomen faced opposition from various cultural authorities. I'm going to give you a few examples. There was disapproval from doctors. This is a quotation on this slide from Dr. Dudley Sargent, who was writing an article in the Ladies' Home Journal. And he said, athletics are making girls bold, masculine, and over-assertive. They are destroying the beautiful lines and curves of her figure and robbing her of her charm. So clearly, he is not happy with sports, what sports was doing to in terms of gender. There was also disapproval from sports authorities. This is a quotation from the International Olympic Committee's medical commission, which put out a report in 1925 that said, we, the Olympics, must not permit sports which tax the muscular frame and put a strain on it for women, which are, of course, wholly unsuitable for the feminine organism, completely unsuitable, which is more delicate and should conserve its energy for the great work before it, that great work being marriage and motherhood. So here you've got the top sports authorities saying sports, serious sports, are inappropriate. Also got disapproval from sports writers. Here's a sports writer who said it would be much better if Babe Didrikson and her ilk stayed at home, got themselves prettied up, and waited for the phone to ring. Another one who said Babe Didrikson prompts discussions about whether the woman athlete should be addressed as Miss, Mrs., Mr., or it. So really ridiculing, unkind coverage in the media. One more quote from a parent, a young woman who loved sports, and her mother said, please, I don't want you to grow up like the Babe Bell. Just don't be like the Babe. That's all I ask. So, okay, a lot of disapproval, but did that disapproval matter? Yes, it did in the 20s. Some of the results, the rules for girls and women's basketball were changed. They divided the court in half and made a rule that no player in the 20s could cross the midcourt line. Half the players had to stay on offense and half the players had to stay on defense. They limited the number of dribbles any one player could do to two at a time. And the message was basically, you're too weak to run across the whole court. You need to calm down and stop being so competitive and so assertive. And unfortunately, this really created the perception that girls and women were playing a lesser game. But it was far more than just basketball. All kinds of limitations were put on both high school and college sports. A lot of schools barred spectators from watching girls do these inappropriate things. A lot of schools switched from offering varsity sports to only offering intramurals. So first year students could play the seniors and sophomores could play the juniors. A lot of schools moved to what they called play days. So in a play day, a college would allow some women athletes go to another college. Let's say NC State would let some of its women athletes go to UNC Chapel Hill. But when they got there, they would mix up the players so that some of the NC State players would be playing with some of the Carolina players so that they wouldn't form intense rivalries and be too competitive. And then after they played some basketball for a while or did some bowling, then they would have a tea or a dance, get dressed up and be feminine again. And there were further cuts made on the number of Olympic sports that women could do, and they cut things like the 800-meter run. 800 meters is like half a mile, so women were no longer allowed to run half a mile in the Olympics, to say nothing of they couldn't run a mile or a 10K or a marathon. And of course, if you think about it, this was totally absurd. People had watched Gertrude Ederle swim for 14 hours across the English Channel, and they'd watch Babe Didrikson. They knew that women were not too weak to do these things. So this was about gender. So some historians like to say that history is like a pendulum. Sometimes that's true. There are periods of change and then periods of going back on that change. And that's true to some degree for women's sports history. So we've talked about how there was resistance. And what I'm going to say is that progress, if you're a fan of women's sports and you wish that it was all a straight line, it was not a straight line. There were ups and downs. And I'll just quickly say that women tended to have fewer athletic opportunities in the 1930s. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because it's not a happy story. And in the interest of time, I'll move on to some other things. But it's not surprising because of the Great Depression. In the 1940s, we get another period of growth. And you get a lot more women playing basketball again. You get a lot more women playing softball. And you get this really important new thing, which is the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. So Ora Washington couldn't be a pro athlete. Babe Didrikson couldn't be a pro athlete in the 20s and 30s. Gertrude Ederle couldn't be a pro athlete with Helen Will. They couldn't be professional athletes. So to get a professional opportunity was an amazing advancement. They got good pay. They got appreciation from fans. I've got a few quotations from the players, some players in the pro league. One said, "It was great. We always had a lot of support. They were always there cheering for us." And in fact, in the peak years of the league, they had from 500,000 to 1 million spectators. These teams were mostly in the Midwest and smaller cities. Another quote, "It was like a dream to get paid for doing something you liked so well." Another, "It was probably the best 8 years of my life. What a thrill." Now, remember I said that women's sports often reflected larger societal trends related to gender? That is absolutely true during World War II. So we're not surprised that there were more athletic opportunities during World War II because of what was going on. So many people were needed to fight during that war that even women were needed in the military. Now, they weren't allowed to do combat jobs, but most jobs, even during wartime, something like 80% are non-combat jobs. So there was important work that women could do. And one of the most elite jobs during World War II was being pilots. And there were women pilots during World War II. This is a recruiting poster. Um, As you can see, it is encouraging women to join the Waves, which is the women's branch of the Navy, because it is a women's war too. Women were not only needed in the military, because so many millions of men went off to war, and the nation needed so much to have a war. They needed planes, they needed ships, they needed submarines, they needed tanks. These things had to be produced really fast. They needed ammunition and uniforms and bandages and bombs. And so the nation had an industrial crisis. And so women were also encouraged to do work that they hadn't done before either. These are a couple of recruiting posters for women during World War II. You can see the one on the left has women wearing pants, which appropriate women did not do before World War II. They were doing all kinds of work, like working on a Jeep and working on planes. And the caption says, "There's work to be done and a war to be won now." And the one on the right says, "Do the job that he left behind. Please apply now." And you've got a woman with a drill. And what's interesting is that before this, women had been told, you know what, using those power tools, that's really work for men. Women aren't really mechanically inclined. So those jobs, those skilled jobs, are reserved for men. And of course, those jobs were much better paid. So now the message was changing. You can do the things that you were told for all these decades that you couldn't do. Now you're being told you can wear shirts like men, have muscles like men, use power tools like men. So gender roles expanded for women during World War II. So that's why it's not surprising that athletic opportunities expanded as well. So I'm going to ask you to think again for a minute. What do you think women's athletic opportunities were going to be like after the war, during the 1950s especially? Yeah, we're going to do one of those pendulum swings again. Now, the 1950s isn't all one thing, but there were a lot of disappointments and limitations um, after the war for women, especially in sports. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League folded. So did a lot of the industrial leagues in North Carolina and the Southern Piedmont. There were a lot of factory teams, textile league teams. They folded in the mid-50s. North Carolina's very popular high school state basketball tournament folded. Athletes were being criticized for being masculine again, just like Mae Didrikson had been. And what's different in the 1950s is that masculine, the term masculine, was now associated with being a lesbian. It had a different connotation in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, it was a bad time to be gay. The federal government was trying to root LGBTQ people out of the military, out of the military, out of any government jobs. Teachers were being fired. Students were being kicked out of colleges. Police were raiding gay bars. Um, it was people were being put in mental institutions for being gay. It was really horrible period to be gay. And so whether you were a lesbian or whether you were a heterosexual woman, um, had a really chilling effect on participating in sports, if you was going to have that connotation. So a few more examples of media reminders that sports was unfeminine in the 50s. On the right is a picture of Maureen Connolly, which in the beginning they said she was kind of a cute feminine girl. Um, then Time magazine said little Mo, the girlish Bobby Sockfer, had turned into Killer Connolly, who had an unladylike grimness. So as soon as she got too good, as soon as she became a champion, they said she was unladylike. Another article from Time magazine about Althea Gibson. Althea grimly set her lips and set out to play a man's game. She sprinted about the court on tireless legs, belted her serve with unladylike gusto. And the Amateur Athletic Union, AAU, was the organization that sponsored swim meets and track meets that were necessary for people to get into the Olympics. And in the AA magazine, there was a quote that said, "We like our women beautiful and feminine. We don't want to marry Amazons." So again, athletic authorities say, don't get too competitive. A quote from Althea Gibson's autobiography. She talked about other people talking about her when she was a youth. "Look at her throwing that ball just like a man," they would say. And they looked at me like I was a freak. Historians have a great piece of evidence about attitudes of sportswomen in the 1950s. There was a woman named Laura Kratz who was doing a dissertation, and for her dissertation research, she interviewed 150 women who described themselves as sportswomen. They loved sports, they liked participating in sports, but they also admitted they felt some aversion to sports. They felt some reluctance. And Kratz summarized the main reasons that they mentioned they felt that aversion: muscles, masculinity, bad taste. Sports was in bad taste for women. Social disapproval, lack of competence, feelings of inadequacy about their bodies. So we can see reasons why women might be reluctant in the 1950s to be seriously participating in sports. But things were complicated. Despite criticism, some athletes competed anyway. Like I said, some of them were willing to defy gender roles. And we've also learned that there were some communities who supported female athletes. They weren't the norm, but there were some. I've tried to look and see, are there some commonalities in those communities? And it's kind of hard to tell. Sometimes they were related to an ethnic or a racial group. So these are, this is a picture of some track stars from Tennessee State, which was a historically Black university. Um, and historian Susan Kahn says that African Americans had slightly different gender expectations than white middle class women in the 50s. They had their ideal womanhood included a little more about struggle and strength as positive qualities. And also, Tennessee State um, trained a bunch of America's main Olympians in the 50s and the early 60s. And so African Americans got some glory by encouraging athletes in a sport that a lot of white women spurned, actually, because of its masculine reputation. Also know about a Polish American track club in Cleveland, of all places. And there were some factories that I mentioned that sponsored teams for their men and women workers. This is a picture of Haynes Hosiery in Winston-Salem. Haynes Hosiery won the national championship a couple of times in the 50s. Um, why? One of the executives at Haynes Hosiery was a big supporter of women's sports. Um, it's hard for us to say why, but in certain communities, there's some in Iowa, there's some in North Carolina, in Gibsonville, North Carolina. Um, the Yao family were encouraged to play in sports, and they're big names in North Carolina sports history. Um, a few important allies, especially male allies, could make a huge difference. Occasionally there were religious organizations. I've seen Jewish community centers in a couple cities sponsored women's teams. Catholic youth organization in some cities sponsored women's teams. So it's hard for us to know why there were some pockets of support. But they were only pockets, and that remained the case until basically the 1970s. And this may be the story you're more familiar with. But in the 70s, there's an explosion of women's sports, but the activism started in the late 1960s. Um, I'm going to give you just a few examples of that activism. This is Catherine Switzer, the woman number 261 in this picture. She had been training to run a marathon. As you know, women were not allowed to run marathons, but she was training on her own, and she applied to enter the Boston Marathon. And when she applied, she just put her first initial K. She didn't put her whole name, so when she was accepted, they didn't know it was a woman. And this is an image of a race official who became infuriated because she was running and was trying to push her off the track. And interestingly, some of the men that she was running with were trying to protect her and to keep her in the race. After she finished this race, Catherine Switzer went on to get to organize on her own marathons all around the world and convince doctors to study women running marathons to prove to Olympic officials that it was safe for women to run this distance. So she was a big, important activist. Here's another important thing starting in the late 60s, a new athletic organization for college women, Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. It sponsored state and national championships for women. It was a really important lobbying organization for Title IX to keep Title IX strong. A few quotes from women coaches. It was a marvelous, exciting place to be. There was encouragement of women for other women to speak up and be more aggressive. There was almost a feeling of family. They were building something important. One of the places that women were advocating for better opportunities in college was at Yale. This was in 1976. This is the crew team, the rowers. They went out and practiced every morning, just like the male rowers did, even though their boats were much worse than the men's team. But what was different was after practice, the men went into a boathouse where they showered and warmed up and changed clothes, but there wasn't a boathouse for women and there weren't showers for women. So they had to get on the bus and sit there and shiver until the men were finished getting ready. And then they all drove back to campus together. Well, they asked their coach, they asked the athletic director, they asked about 4 different times, and they said, yeah, someday you'll get that. And they got fed up, and so they decided to have a little direct action. And what they did is they wrote a statement, and they went together as a team into the associate athletic director's office, and they read their statement. And while they were there, they stripped off their tops and showed Title IX written on their chests and their backs. You can see the associate athletic director here is not too excited about this, but they were really savvy because they invited a writer and a photographer from the Yale newspaper to document the moment. And this story was picked up by the New York Times, and Yale alumni were appalled at the treatment of their women's crew team. And in no time, of course, they got their showers. There were also girls and their parents all over the country pushing to get into Little League. About 20 different lawsuits were filed in the 70s to try to force Little League to let girls play. This is a picture of Maria Pepe. Her lawsuit won. Unfortunately, she was almost too old and only got to play 3 games. However, what she did was awfully important for other girls. This is probably a story you're familiar with, Billie Jean King on the right. She and other tennis pros felt that they were not getting decent compensation, fair compensation from the United States Lawn Tennis Association, the organization that was in charge of all the tournaments that men and women played in, like the US Open. They were rebuffed in their efforts to get better prize money, and so they boycotted a tournament first, and that didn't make any difference. And so then they went out on their own and organized a tournament on their own, and that didn't make any difference. And finally, they ended up starting their own tour, a whole set of tournaments. They went out and got their own corporate sponsors, raised money, did all their own marketing, and proved that they could draw audiences, that they were equally skilled players and entertainers. So these were just a few of the many examples of activism on behalf of women's sports in the 70s. And this is no surprise to historians, and probably not to you at this point, because of what else was going on during this time period, which is the women's liberation movement. Women's liberation movement wanted girls and women to have equal opportunities in all areas, all kinds of workplaces, in government, in media, in religious institutions, in families, equal pay. And they wanted girls to be raised differently with a more expansive gender role. They wanted girls to be raised thinking of themselves as just as smart and capable as boys. They wanted them to be strong and to have high aspirations and role models. They wanted to stop rape and sexual harassment, turning females into victims. They wanted girls and women to have choices about who to love, whether and when to have children, familiarity with their bodies, and control over their bodies. So it's not surprising that feminists were supporting women's sports as well. So most people know that story, and they know what a big difference that Title IX made. But they often don't know that the change didn't come easily. It didn't happen magically. It was really a struggle in community after community, school after school, college after college. Remember, whenever there's people pushing for change, there's usually people opposing that change, resisting that change. And just to give you a couple of examples, in tennis, the United States Lawn Tennis Association pushed back hard, really tried to undermine the efforts of Billie Jean King and the tennis pros. They said, really, you deserve an 8-to-1 ratio. Men should get 8 times as much money as women tennis pros. Oh, maybe 6-to-1, maybe 5-to-1. And Bobby Riggs, who enjoyed being what he called himself, a male chauvinist pig, said women belong in the bedroom and the kitchen in that order. The NCAA pushed hard to weaken Title IX. It said colleges were not discriminating, that women just didn't want to play sports. It said Title IX rules were going to destroy men's sports. It called the regulations asinine, unreasonable, and arbitrary. And later, when it became clear that Title IX was not going to go away, despite congressional efforts to do that periodically, it decided it needed to run women's sports and basically put the AIAW out of business, the organization that first sponsored women's championships and nurtured women coaches. It was a really chilly climate for college coaches. I've done a lot of research on this, and these are some quotes out of many of interviews in 1979. One coach saying, "I'm not allowed to meet with the other women coaches on anything, especially Title IX." Another one saying, "I've personally been told to play it low key, or I won't be around if I don't." Another woman said, "Our men's athletic director has even gone so far as to tell our board of regents that I was a homosexual, trying to get her fired." Heard these stories over and over again. A chilly climate, it was risky to push for change, to try to get better locker rooms, better facilities to play in, more coaches, better equipment, scholarships, recruiting budgets. It was just a battle for everything. And like I said, in community after community to get girls' sports as well. Also opposition from judges. While there were some judges that sympathized in lawsuits and ruled on behalf of girls and women. This is a quotation from a judge in 1971. There were girls who wanted to run cross country. There was no high school cross country team, so they wanted to run on the boys' team. And this is what the judge said in his decision. "Athletic competition builds character in our boys. We do not need that kind of character in our girls, the women of tomorrow." But as you know, the activism made a difference gradually. I know this is a really busy slide, so I wanted to give you a graphic to show you visually the changes that happened in education. So what you're looking at on the left is high school, and the numbers are between 1971, right before Title IX was passed, and 2010. So about 40 years difference. And the purple is the number of girls who played high school sports, varsity sports. In high school, girls made up 7% of all high school athletes. So the little tiny purple bar. And then the larger purple bar is about 40 years later. And in that bar represents girls were 41% of high school athletes. So it jumped from 7% to 41% in about 40 years. And you can see the teal bars are the number of male athletes in high schools. So you can see that they did not lose opportunities. Their opportunities increased as well. The graph on the left are college numbers, which were slightly better than high school in 1971. In college in 1971, women made up 15% of college athletes in 1971. And in 2010, it was 43%. So again, you can see dramatically how much the purple lines increased. And you can see that male athletes did not lose opportunities. And improvements were made in all those other areas like scholarships, a number of coaches, food, training, travel, scholarships, etc. It's not equal. It wasn't equal in 2010, but it is much closer. So like night and day. And of course, things are like night and day between the 60s and today. We can see a lot of changes. There are also judges saying the institution of Little League is as American as the hot dog and apple pie. There's no reason why that part of Americana should be withheld from girls. Serena Williams, just one example of a tennis pro who made many, many millions of dollars, made a great living and was allowed to be herself, unapologetically assertive, her own style, her talent appreciated, almost record number of tournaments won. On the left, we've got Candace Parker dunking, soaring, I would say, at the University of Tennessee. Players like her now are in the WNBA, have professional opportunities. On the right, we've got women running marathons. They run in marathons in every city in the US, all over the world. They run in the Olympics. Their times are getting better all the time. Here we've got the US women's national soccer team. You probably know they have had much more success than the men's soccer team. They are heroes to girls all over the country who play soccer. And they recently were successful in their efforts to get comparable benefits to the men's team. And this is a quotation from former athlete, former coach, and former athletic director, Marilee Dean Baker. And I love it. It says, "I was called a tomboy. My daughters are called athletes." So I want to just wrap up by summarizing where I have been. Big idea is that there were ups and downs in the 20th century. And when there were downs, it was usually because those women athletes were held back by restrictive ideas about gender. Despite those restrictive ideas, some women defied the norms. Another part of my thesis was that when there were ups, those improvements tended to be at times when things in general in American society were expanding opportunities for women. When women were activists and trying to get more opportunities, they usually encountered opposition. The good news is that gender norms have changed. They can and they do change. Opportunities have come when athletes themselves were willing to defy gender norms, when they had the courage of their convictions to follow what they loved. And they've also come because there were allies. Their parents, coaches, teachers, friends, community members, or other allies pushed for opportunities as well as they themselves. So I would say that women's sports history in the 20th century is a story that sometimes was sad, often was sad, but it's also a story of hope because gender norms can and do change. So I'm going to quit there and thank you for your attention. And Stacy, do we have time for a couple questions?
We absolutely, excuse me, we absolutely do. And I believe that Patrick is going to take care of that for us.
Okay, thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, okay. We have a couple of questions coming in. The first one is, do we ever know, like, did a lot of North Carolina women play in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League?
I'm not 100% sure I heard you. Was it whether North Carolina women played?
Yeah, if there was like a lot of North Carolina women, yeah.
Yeah, I am not sure about that. There were women from all over in the league, including a few women from Cuba and Canada, but the majority came from the Midwest.
Great, thank you. Also, another question is, what sort of sports were sort of more accepted for women, and then what sort of sports were sort of like less accepted for women during the 20th century?
Yeah, no, there's definite trends about that. Sports that were considered more feminine included individual sports, so non-contact, like tennis and golf. But I don't think it's a coincidence that those sports also were more associated with upper class folks. In their early history, you pretty much had to belong to a country club to have access to a tennis court or a golf course. So I think that there's a combination of being individual sports, non-contact sports, and being white upper class sports, and that legacy has kind of moved forward. And sports like track and field, um, even though the events are individual, it's a team sport, but it takes a lot of strength, it takes a lot of coordination, but it's also a sport that you don't need a ton of equipment. And it was a place where schools or communities, I mean, anybody can run a race almost anywhere. So it is more associated with poor people. Um, uh, but anyway, so basketball, contact sport, even though it's really started in women's colleges. So that one's kind of an interesting, maybe a little bit of an exception. Softball tends to be working class, also tends to be considered less feminine through the 20th century. So team sports, very physical sports, something like roller derby, very physical, very not considered feminine. So yeah, I think those are some of the trends, I would say.
Great, thank you. See, well, one more question. I think we have time for one more. So, were athletes like Babe Dickinson helpful in promoting like the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century?
Um, Babe was not she was not political, but also the timing didn't really work for her. So women actually get the vote in 1920, and Gertrude Ederle was a feminist and did want better opportunities for women, but women already had the vote by the time she advocated for women's equality, and by the time she became famous. And I don't think that Babe Dickinson was very political. She was really all about her sports.
Well, thank you so much, Professor, for helping us to celebrate Women's History Month by sharing this incredible history and your research about it with us. This was really awesome.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who listened and for your questions.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming out this evening. We hope to see you as we continue to celebrate Women's History Month at our next Women's History Month program, History at High Noon, Listen to How She Changed the World. That's a hybrid program taking place over Zoom as well as in person at the museum on Wednesday, March 20th, starting at noon. In the meantime, we hope all of you have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.